process of interpreting kind of history and the nation's own sense of itself through the lens of these is kind of the core, if you will, narrative pieces of civil religion. And what's wrapped up in this course always is a wonderful word. You think of this word, mythos. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Robert Wuthnow called American Mythos. It's written a couple years ago, where he talks about like what are some of kind of the core overarching narrative themes, ideas, statements about what it means to be an American nation. Now, sociologists, we always know this is contested, right? We always know it's not like everybody's walking around just in their head in complete agreement. And so that's one kind of side of criticism we could go down with civil religion. But for now, let's try and understand it for what it is as this kind of overarching framework for the United States of America. So these are some kind of core elements, as I said, to build the narrative structure and to actually to fill in the content of civil religion. But then civil religion also lives off of other cultural elements. So, for example, in this country, it's a very kind of individualistic society, right? It's also a society that values ideas such as the free market, if you will. So now again, these can all be contested, but these are other cultural elements that start to kind of get stirred into civil religion, so that when we study the meanings and themes of civil religion, this is some of the stuff that starts to come out. And then finally, there's these what we could call religious elements, right? We talked about last week how the country was basically founded more or less on kind of a Protestant majority, kind of a Protestant ethic, and even if the founders were writing the things they wrote in terms of freedom of religion, there was still kind of this knee-jerk awareness or acceptance that that religion was good. It was here to stay as long as it wasn't completely linked up to the state. So there's this kind of underlying acceptance of religion and religious themes, and then all the religious stories that come along with kind of official religious groups. So this all kind of gets mashed together, if you will, into this concept we call civil religion. So now let's talk about a few details, the meats of the argument, and this is what the Bella reading was quite a bit about. And basically, you can think in a Durkheimian way, all right? So think like Emile Durkheim. I know you like to sit around and do that anyhow, so let's do it again. So what would Emile Durkheim look for if he was trying to study the religion of a group? Well, he'd look at their beliefs, he'd look at their symbols, he'd look at their rituals. Okay, this should all be ringing a bell for you, because this is stuff we've studied before. And what Bella basically says, he's like, well, I'm gonna divide U.S. history, and I'm gonna look at the early or colonial period. I'm gonna look at the Civil War, and then he says I'm gonna look at the Kennedy era, we could call it. Remember, he's writing only at the end of the Kennedy era, so we can forgive him for not being up to date. And so then he goes through and he says, oh, well, what am I finding and how does he find this stuff? Well, he goes back, he looks to documents, he goes back and looks at history books, sees what's highlighted, looks at what people are talking about still now, what are newspapers saying. So in some way, Bella's doing kind of an interpretive, kind of overarching gaze at U.S. history and trying to kind of pull out like what seem to be the religious, in a Durkheim way, elements that recur, that come back. And so what's some of the stuff he finds? Well, one of the things he says early on, it looked like one of the core beliefs was this story from Exodus. So this is one of those kind of religious cultural elements that's laying around in the culture, and this idea of being a chosen people, right? And what was the symbol? Well, a classic one is light on a hill, which is straight from Christian scriptures. And embody in the Declaration of Independence. So this chosen people who will do this whole new American experiment in a new land and bring knowledge and wisdom and freedom and all that sort of stuff. And what are some of the rituals? Well, early on we have the inaugurations as a big event, and as we read about last week, wow, Thanksgiving, right? So this thing that was talked about even back in the Continental Congress in terms of a quasi-religious holiday is a key ritual at the time. So then, Robert Bella takes us forward and he says, all right, well, it seems to me, reading history, and reading the nature of the United States community, that things have changed. So what are some of the themes or the beliefs in the Civil War era? Well, he looks at a lot of Lincoln's speeches. And now this is one problem he has, right, is he focused a lot on official text or on the speeches of what we would call the figureheads of civil religion, which is very different than actually in a lot of ways of how sociologists study religion, which essentially see what people think. Maybe if we were to do Robert Bell again, we would actually try and read the diaries of people who weren't famous historical actors and try and tease out from that themes. But for here, we'll just deal with what Bella has. So he says, well, in the Civil War era, the beliefs are a lot about cost and sacrifices, tearing apart of the country. And that is shown in places like cemeteries. So these become a really big deal, right? Become a symbol of this kind of belief that has been lived out by the social group. Very interesting, actually, the president of Harvard, actually, she's a historian. She just wrote a great book, a bestseller, the name is escaping me right now, about how the Civil War caused these massive changes in the way that people in the United States think about the dead and think about death, and how there was this development of all these new rituals and memorials and embalming. Those are all new things coming out of the Civil War era as a way to try to kind of memorialize what was happening, to sacrifice what was happening. And so what are some rituals? Well, like Memorial Day, there's one, okay? That comes to us out of the Civil War period. And then Bella takes us up to the era again, and you know, he says in the Kennedy era, it's a little tension. There's some sacrifice going on, but there's also kind of some repentance going on, right? So we have the failure in Vietnam, the awareness of the continued segregation and oppression of black people and women and other minorities. So we have this kind of moment where there's this tension, and where at least the figurehead, Kennedy, and some of the leaders of the day are kind of trying to get to kind of lead a sense of repentance. And then Kennedy himself becomes a symbol, right? Because of the assassination of the president. And actually all those bodies, all those assassinations, and all those deaths, you can think of everything from the film of Kent State, to Bobby Kennedy, to Martin Luther King, to even Malcolm X at one level, especially for some groups within the United States, all become bodily symbols of beliefs that people were articulating at the time. And then finally, for rituals, Bella says, well, he names a couple. He says, of course, then ritual with all the deaths that were occurring, but he got, passing laws, Civil Act and poverty, all that were all articulating this belief in repentance and the possibility of making something better out of the country. So that's kind of a brief 2-cent overview of Bella's argument. And what I was trying to do was to frame it by saying, well, we do it in this Durkheimian way with these key elements, and then we go through these periods in history. And the question at some way, and we could have even talked about this if we wanted to, is what's over here? So the question mark is, well, what now? Maybe there was a 1980s, 1990s era. Maybe there's an era now, we could call it the post-9/11 era. And maybe some of the belief, at least right after 9/11, was the ability to spread security. So that would be one kind of security, and the possibility of spreading freedom, right? And so some symbols at that time for sure would be the Twin Towers, would definitely be a key symbol, right? But also, I'm guessing historians and sociologists are going to look back and say, well, there's something about the Barack Obama election of somebody so kind of from establishment in many ways, and professionally in terms of what his background was, but also in terms of race. And so we continue